Romans chapter 10, this is where we'll spend our time. Romans chapters 1 through 12, he is summing up here his arguments regarding humanity's relationship to God, what the cross means. He's contrasting the way of grace and works and the distinctions therein. And he uses as a way of teaching this the Jewish nation. He looks at the Jewish nation and says, this is the Jewish nation's take on how this is all supposed to work. And for the Jew, there was this ladder that was being climbed in terms of behavior, even though that's not really how it worked. I mean, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So what shocked the Jewish nation, and this is why I think Paul writes this to the Roman church specifically, is that the Jewish converts were also being gathered with Gentile converts. And this was just unbelievable to them, that these Gentiles, the swine, could actually become believers and have a co-equal standing with God. So it's really hard for the Jewish mindset to let go of that picture that they have regarding how righteousness is imparted. So let's take a look at this text. It's chapter 10, verse 1. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God on behalf of my fellow Israelites is for their salvation. For I can testify that they have a zeal for God, but their zeal is not in line with the truth. For ignoring the righteousness that comes from God and seeking instead to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law, with the result that there's righteousness for everyone who believes. Moses writes about the righteousness that is by the law. The one who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, it's in your mouth, in your heart. That is the word of faith that we preach. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes, thus has righteousness. With the mouth one confesses, and thus has salvation. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. There's no distinction between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord is the Lord of all, who richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now this text outlines something that is just completely counterintuitive to the Jewish mind, but you have to remember, Paul is a Jew of the Jews. I mean, this guy, his whole education is Jewish. He's a Pharisee of the Pharisees, born to the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day before the law, blameless. I mean, this guy knows his Tanakh. He knows his Old Testament. For him, the whole Scripture, that's all he has. And he knows it very well. And he understands the Jewish mindset of the eternal God who has an eternal requirement for perfection for every person that's going to come to him and be acceptable to God. And the Jews held on to this arrangement. They believed sincerely that the balance was a scale, and that if they piled up good behavior on this side and it outweighed the bad behavior on this side, that God would accept them. And that's how they viewed it. Just imagine having to climb that kind of ladder every day of your life, and being told from the time you're a tiny child that the only way you could be acceptable to God was that you climbed that ladder, and when at the end of climbing you'd actually reached a place where the balance is tipped in your favor. That's just unbelievable to me, to have to live like that, but that's how the Jewish mind operated. And the Jewish mind went further because of that. Now think, if you really believe that, there comes a point where God almost becomes in your debt. He's indebted to you. That's Paul's argument in Romans chapters 4 and 5. The wages paid are something that you're owed. And so the Jew really thought that because they behaved a certain way and they're God's chosen people, that God owed them this. It was more than just, and think how that would read if you were not a Jew and you were encountering Jewish people, how you would look at yourself very differently compared to the Jew. The Jew was God's chosen, and there were things that the Jewish person could not do that you could do, and the reason for it, let's say you wanted to have a barbecue, a Boston butt, right? And so you invite your Jewish friends over for the Boston butt barbecue, and they say, oy vey, we can't come to that because it's unrighteousness for us. Imagine how that would sting. After a while, if you're a Gentile, you're going to start to look at that and say, well, wait a minute now. I mean, how you're saying that I'm unrighteous before God because I'm going to eat the Boston butt. And after a while, that would start to become a thorn in your side with regard to the Jewish nation. And this is one of the reasons in Paul's writing here, in the Roman congregations, this was a thorn in their side between the Gentiles and the Jews. The moral law was part of every Jew's life from birth. That was the commandment. Deuteronomy chapter 6 through 8. From the time you wake up to the time you go to bed, the first thing you should think about, our God is one. And you should proceed from there. So everything, the source of the law became forgotten. And the law became all important. And there was no relationship any longer. This is how the God of Israel became for the Jewish mind a stumbling block for them. The gospel was a stumbling block. And the reason is, you're bypassing the ladder. You're saying, I don't have to climb that ladder. In order to gain God's mercy, I don't have to climb the ladder. Well, that's not the Jewish mindset at all. And if you're taught that from the time you're a child, it's impossible to think. There are things like that we think still to this day, we who are sitting in here. And so it's very hard that if a person is going to come to God and not accept the mercy that He offers, then there are alternatives, right? And one alternative is, I'm going to grit my teeth and behave really well, and then God's going to owe me when it comes time for me to leave this world. Climbing the ladder of works. Think about it. Let's put it this way. Who in prison really likes the prison guard? Right? I mean, if you're in a concentration camp, do you really like the guards? But you have to obey them, right? You have to do what the guard says, or bad things are going to happen. That's how the mindset of the Jewish person thought about God. If I misbehave, God's going to punish me. So I've got to toe the line. That is right on the edge of paganism. Right on the edge. Because for the pagan, what you wanted to do was you wanted Zeus, Thor, Poseidon, all the rest of the mob. You didn't want them to even look at you. You didn't want them to take account of anything you were doing, thinking, saying, or being. You wanted them to just look the other way your whole life. Because you didn't want to involve yourself with these beings. Because it never worked out good. Think about this from the perspective of the Jew. In the same way, climbing that perpetual ladder, I've got to behave in a certain way. I've got to tip the scale in my favor. And never knowing where the scale tips, right? Isn't that the message of the prodigal? We focus on the prodigal. You know, he went off and he spent his fortune, his father's inheritance, and he squandered it, but the father saw him coming. He finally came to his senses. He's coming home, and the father runs out to meet him. We love that part, but we forget the other son. What happened to him? He was upset. Dad, I've done the right thing all my life. I've climbed the ladder. And you're going to throw a party for him. What about me? That's exactly how people would look at God from that arrangement. That's exactly how you would look at God. What about me? I've done the right things. Now I'm going to become resentful because I have obeyed. I've struggled with this ladder all my life, and you're not going to throw a party for me? Believe it or not, there are a lot of Christians who believe this way. I have encountered some of them in my correspondences who think that the law is still there and then all the law has to be obeyed, and if you don't obey the 613 precepts of the Mosaic Law, you're not really a Christian. So for the Jews who read this letter in Rome, in Jesus' day and in Paul's day, this is how they would look at it. And the balances could be tipped in their favor. There were three kinds of Jews. This is really simple, but this is the truth. The Jewish mindset worked this way in Jesus' day. There were three kinds. There was a good one. That was somebody who behaved in a way to tip the balances in their favor. There was a bad one. That's a person who tipped the balances the other way. And then there were in between. That was most people were in between. You know how it worked for them? One more good deed. Just one more. Of course, in the course of any given day, there are going to be some bad ones too, right? So you're just fighting this battle your whole life as the Jew who's in between, searching out for that one more good deed that's going to tip the scales for you. How do you ever know? How do you ever know when you've done enough? When can I come to a place where I don't worry about this anymore? You can't. So this shows us that this understanding is a shadow of what God really intended. Even in the Old Testament times, Abraham believed God. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. It doesn't say Abraham did all the right things and God reckoned it to him. It says he believed. So it's never changed. It's always been the same. It's just that the cross shows us how God's justice is satisfied so that anybody then can come, Jew or Gentile. If there was conflict somewhere in the Old Testament and the Jewish mindset and salvation, Paul would have said that. He would have said that. Paul quotes Joel chapter 2 here, and he says, all who come to the Lord can be saved, are saved. I mean, that's an Old Testament text. You know what the beautiful thing about a Jew who becomes a believer is? One of the most fascinating things, they get their Old Testament back. They get it back. The whole Old Testament becomes useful in a way that they never would have imagined otherwise. And we look at people all over the world involved in other world religions and we kind of laugh at them. I remember I told the story to you guys once about this Swami, a Hindu Swami, who Hinduism, one of the ways to practice Hinduism is the way of devotion. And his practice was he felt called to roll on the ground everywhere he went. I mean, literally, lay down on the ground and just roll everywhere. Now, you can imagine what your clothing would look like after a few years of that. I mean, clothing doesn't survive well when it's tumbled on the rocks and the dirt and everything else on the ground. He rolled for years. This idea that somehow he was placating the Hindu understanding of who God is and that he would reach what they would call moksha, that is release from the wheel of reincarnation, if he would just be devoted enough to climb that ladder his whole life by rolling around on the ground. Now we look at that, or we look at the Jains, another sect of Hinduism, who wear masks, not because of COVID, but because they don't want to suck a bug in and kill the bug by sucking it in. Because they have a reverence for life, because after all, that bug might be Aunt Myrtle in one of the processes of reincarnation where she's on her transmigratory journey to moksha. And we look at that and we kind of smile. It seems humorous to us, but it's deadly serious for anybody who's climbing that ladder. Deadly serious. If a person in the Jewish mindset was going to be close to God, the only way they did that was to be a religious zealot. That's why the Pharisees were so admired. This is why Jesus said what he did in Matthew 23 regarding the common people and chastising the religious zealots, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians. Because the list of do's and don'ts that they heaped up on people, they couldn't keep themselves, and the common person certainly couldn't keep them, because the common person had to go out and make a living every day. They weren't supported by the temple tax. And so they didn't have time in their life to observe all this stuff. Jesus says this, he says, "Woe to you experts in the law, you Pharisees, you hypocrites. You keep locking people out of the kingdom of heaven, for you don't enter in, and you don't even permit those who are trying to enter in, to enter in." Well, we do this same thing today. We do. We talked about it a little bit in Sunday school this morning. We place burdens in front of people who want to come to salvation. We stack up a real complex theology and we say, if you don't meet these requirements, you can't come to God and have the mercy that He offers. But Paul clears all this up. We read it today. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you believe in your heart God raised Him from the dead, you are saved. Nothing more. For with the heart one believes and has righteousness, and with the mouth one confesses and has salvation. You know, we can come in here, and we do this on Sunday mornings for Sunday school. We have I find them interesting, maybe nobody else does, interesting conversations about theological concepts. We're studying right now hell and punishment. And we can have big discussions. I can take you to my house and show you 2 giant shelves full of theological books. Some of them are very fat. And they go through all of the details of how God works and what God's like and how salvation works and how Jesus can be both God and human at the same time and all the descriptions therein. And I've thousands and thousands of pages written on these subjects. And it's interesting. It is. Because we're talking about a being with this little book in our hands that we think we understand. We think we understand Him. But those discussions are in-house discussions. They're in-house. They're not the kinds of discussions that if they ever rise to the place where they keep people out from coming to Jesus in the way that Paul says here, then they're discussions we shouldn't be having at all. Paul, in this text, if you get a study Bible, check it out for yourself. More than half the text is quotation from the Old Testament, talking about salvation and grace. More than half of it. Because that's all Paul's got, is an Old Testament. The Jews were not blessed totally just because of who they were. In fact, they weren't blessed for who they were at all. They weren't. Abraham was just another Semite running around on the Mesopotamian plains and mountains. They were blessed because of whose they were. And it's the same for us. The most fascinating text here, now think about this. Paul says, anybody who trusts in the Lord will not be put to shame. Now think about what that means for a minute. You remember when the Jews came out of Egypt? And at some point in that trajectory, they became so difficult that God wanted to destroy them and start over with Moses. You remember that? He just said, look, I'm going to get rid of these people and I'm just going to start again. What did Moses say? Lord, if you do that, what will all the nations around us say about you? That you took your people out of Egypt just to destroy them? Anyone who trusts in the Lord will never, ever be put to shame. I love that because it takes the whole thing out of my hands. It's not hinged on my ability to live rightly. It's not hinged on my ability even to hold on to God's hand tight enough. It's hinged on His ability to keep a promise. And He will. Man, that's if I could leave anybody with, if you don't remember anything about this sermon, which is likely, it's very likely that nobody will remember any of it. Don't forget that. Anybody who walks with the Lord, who trusts in Him, will not be put to shame. So if I meet somebody that I want to talk to them about the Lord, they may not believe, but I'll never be put to shame for having spoken to them about the Lord. That's the Lord's problem, not mine. My problem is just to belong to Him. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,